No one in Shadow Creek had ever seen anything like it. There in the soft light of dawn, the massive grizzly bear stood motionless beside the fresh grave. Her powerful frame, usually a source of terror, seemed to sync with what looked like sorrow. The same claws that had taken Robert Wilson's life just days ago now gently touched the disturbed earth where he lay. The sound that echoed through the morning mist was not a growl or a roar, but something else entirely. Something that made even the most hardened hunters question everything they knew about these wild creatures. It was a sound of grief. The locals who witnessed it would never forget that morning. Some called it impossible. Others said it was nature's way of showing remorse. But everyone agreed on one thing. The bear that had killed the most respected hunter in the valley had returned to his grave. And she was crying. This story began 3 weeks earlier, when the spring sun first warmed the Montana mountains. And no one could have imagined how a tragic encounter would reveal something extraordinary about the wild creatures we think we understand. They called her the Guardian of Shadow Creek, though no one had given her this name officially. She appeared in the valley 5 years ago, when the aspens were turning gold and the first snow dusted the mountaintops. Unlike other grizzlies that wandered through the territory, she chose to stay, making the dense forest and hidden meadows her permanent home. From the beginning, there was something different about her. The old-timers who had lived in these mountains their whole lives said they had never seen a bear quite like her. She moved with purpose, almost as if she understood the delicate balance between the wild and human worlds. Her eyes held an intelligence that made even experienced hunters pause and reconsider their steps. Local rangers began collecting stories about her unusual behavior. There was the time she guided a lost calf back to Miller's farm, keeping her distance but clearly shepherding the young animal home. Then there was the morning when she encountered a group of hikers on a narrow trail. Instead of showing aggression, she simply sat down and waited until they backed away, teaching them without violence how to respect her space. Children at the Shadow Creek school knew her through their parents' tales. "Watch for the tracks with the crooked claw mark," they would say. "That is her signature. If you see it, give her space, and she will give you the same." Her crooked right paw print became a sign of safety rather than danger. When people saw it, they knew they were in her territory, where somehow the usual rules of wild encounters did not apply. As seasons passed, she became more than just a bear. She was a guardian of the natural order, protecting her territory not through fear, but through an unspoken understanding with the humans who shared her realm. Scientists who came to study her spoke of advanced cognitive abilities, of problem-solving skills that challenged their previous understanding of wild animals. But the locals knew her as something simpler and more profound. She was the spirit of the mountains themselves, wise and watchful. That spring, when the wildflowers began painting the meadows in waves of purple and gold, she had seemed more present than ever. Her tracks appeared near the edge of town more frequently, though she never caused trouble. Some said she was warning them, trying to tell them something about the changes coming to their shared home. If only they had understood her message sooner. If only Robert Wilson, for all his experience and wisdom, had recognized what she was trying to tell them that fateful morning. James Matthews was not a man who rushed into anything. At 68 years old, his weathered face and calloused hands told stories of a lifetime spent in these mountains. The locals of Shadow Creek knew him as Old Jim, though there was nothing weak or frail about him. His eyes still held the sharp gleam of a man who read the forest like others read their morning newspaper. For more than 4 decades, Jim had walked these trails with a respect few hunters possessed. He never took more than he needed, never hunted during breeding seasons, and always gave thanks for what the land provided. His cabin, nestled against the foothills, held no flashy trophies or mounted heads. Instead, its walls displayed detailed sketches of wildlife and handwritten journals documenting the patterns and behaviors of the creatures he observed. The morning crowd at Carol's Diner knew they could count on Jim's stories. He would sit at his usual corner table, warming his hands around a coffee mug, sharing wisdom about the changing seasons and animal movements. Young hunters sought his advice, knowing that his words carried decades of experience. "The forest speaks to those who listen," he would tell them, "but you have to earn its trust first." When stories of the Guardian began spreading through Shadow Creek, Jim listened with unusual interest. Other hunters boasted about tracking her, but Jim stayed quiet, making notes in his worn leather journal. He understood something the others missed. This bear was not just another trophy to pursue. She represented something ancient, something worthy of study rather than conquest. The spring morning when Jim announced his intention to track the guardian, a hush fell over the diner. Carol herself stopped wiping tables to listen. Not to hunt her, Jim clarified, seeing the concern on their faces. To understand her. There is something about this bear that could teach us all a lesson in living with the wild. Ranger Sarah Peterson, who had known Jim for 20 years, tried to talk him out of it. The guardian has been different lately, Jim, more protective of her territory. Even the usual wildlife patterns have changed around her. But Jim just smiled that knowing smile of his, the one that had seen 1,000 mountain sunrises. The changes in the forest had not escaped Jim's notice. The usual spring bird song seemed subdued. Deer trails that had existed for generations suddenly shifted away from certain areas. Even the wind carried strange messages, whispers that made the back of his neck tingle. Nature was trying to tell him something, but for the first time in his life, Jim was not sure he fully understood its meaning. The night before he set out, Jim sat on his cabin porch watching the stars. The moon cast long shadows through the pine trees, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled. He felt an unusual heaviness in his chest, a sensation he had never experienced before all his years of hunting. His old hound Buck, who had accompanied him on countless trips, whined softly and pressed against his leg. Early the next morning, Jim stepped onto his porch one last time. The dawn air carried the scent of wild roses and pine, but there was something else, a stillness that made him pause. Buck refused to leave the cabin, something he had never done before. Jim looked at his trusted rifle, then back at the nervous dog. For a moment he considered staying home, but the mystery of the guardian called to him. He had spent his whole life learning the ways of the forest. Now he felt was the time to put that knowledge to its greatest test. As Jim disappeared into the misty morning forest, he did not know that every step took him closer to an encounter that would become legend. The guardian was waiting, and the mountains held their breath. The morning mist still clung to the valley when Jim found her first tracks. The guardian's distinctive crooked paw print marked the soft earth near a mountain stream. Fresh. She had passed through less than an hour ago. Jim knelt down, running his fingers lightly over the impression. Something about the depth and spacing of the tracks told him she was not alone. Moving with the silence of decades of experience, Jim followed the trail up through a grove of young aspens. The morning sun filtered through their leaves, creating dancing shadows on the forest floor. Then he saw her. The guardian stood in a small clearing, her massive form silhouetted against the morning light. She was even more magnificent than the story suggested. Jim remained motionless, his rifle untouched across his back. The bear was teaching two cubs how to dig for roots, her movements gentle and purposeful. He watched in wonder as she demonstrated the technique, then stepped back to let her cubs practice. When one cub grew frustrated, she made a soft sound, almost like humming, that seemed to calm the little one. For nearly an hour, Jim observed this family scene, making mental notes that he would never get to write down. The guardian showed a level of patience and intelligence that challenged everything he thought he knew about these creatures. Several times she lifted her head and looked directly toward his hiding spot, but she made no aggressive moves. It was almost as if she was allowing him to witness this private moment. The tragedy began with a simple shift in the wind. A sudden gust brought Jim's scent directly to the bears, but it carried something else too, the sharp smell of another predator, mountain lion. The guardian's demeanor changed instantly. Her cubs, sensing the danger, scrambled closer to their mother. Jim could see the conflict in her behavior. She could smell both threats, but could not see their exact locations. Jim understood too late what was happening. The mountain lion's scent on the wind had placed him between the guardian and an unseen danger. He slowly began to back away, trying to defuse the situation. But fate had other plans. A loose rock shifted under his foot, sending a small cascade of pebbles down the slope. The guardian reacted to protect her cubs from what she perceived as an approaching threat. She charged not out of aggression, but out of maternal instinct. Jim saw in her eyes not anger, but fear for her cubs. He reached for his rifle, not to shoot, but to fire a warning shot into the air. The movement was too quick, too sudden. In that final moment, As the guardian closed the distance, Jim understood everything. He saw in her eyes recognition, then regret, but the momentum of her charge could not be stopped. His last thought was not of fear, but of appreciation for the raw power and beauty of nature, even as it claimed him. The impact came swiftly. Jim's body was found later that day by Ranger Peterson, who had grown concerned when his truck remained parked at the trailhead too long. The Guardian's tracks told the rest of the story. They showed how she had paced around him afterward, how she had gently nudged him, as if trying to undo what could not be undone. Most telling were the marks where she had carefully covered him with forest debris, a behavior bears usually reserve for food they intended to return to. But this was different. It was almost like she was protecting him. The Guardian and her cubs vanished into the deeper wilderness after that day. The forest fell quiet in a way the locals had never experienced before. It was as if the mountains themselves were mourning the loss of one of their most devoted students. But this was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning of something that would challenge everything they thought they knew about the creatures who shared their world. News travels fast in small mountain towns. By sunset, everyone in Shadow Creek knew about Jim. Carol closed her diner early for the first time in 20 years. The usual evening bustle of Main Street fell silent. Even the children who normally played until dusk were called inside early, their parents holding them a little tighter than usual. Ranger Peterson sat at her desk that night, writing her official report with trembling hands. The evidence at the scene told a story few would understand. No signs of a prolonged fight, no defensive wounds. Jim's rifle had never been fired. Most puzzling were the gentle way his body had been covered with leaves and the strange circular pattern of the Guardian's tracks around him, as if she had stood guard for hours after the encounter. The town council gathered in an emergency meeting the next morning. The usual calls for hunting parties and revenge were surprisingly quiet. Perhaps it was because everyone had known Jim's views about living in harmony with nature. Mayor Thompson spoke first. Jim always said he wanted to be buried up there, among the peaks he loved. I say we honor his wishes. They chose a spot Jim had often mentioned in his stories, a peaceful clearing overlooking the valley, where he had spent countless hours observing wildlife. It seemed fitting that his final rest would be in the wilderness he had respected so deeply. The entire town turned out for the burial, forming a long procession up the mountain trail. As the community grieved, search parties went out looking for the Guardian and her cubs. But the bear family had vanished. Experienced trackers found signs leading deep into the most remote parts of the wilderness. Then nothing. It was as if they had become ghosts. Some said the Guardian was hiding out of shame. Others believed she was honoring Jim's memory by keeping her distance from humans. Strange stories began circulating in the days that followed. A group of hikers reported seeing the Guardian watching Jim's burial from a distant ridge, standing completely still like a sentinel. Two young boys claimed they saw her leading her cubs in a wide circle around the town, avoiding all human contact but maintaining her protective presence. At Carol's diner, Jim's usual corner table remained empty. No one had the heart to sit there. His coffee cup still hung on its hook behind the counter, a silent reminder of the man who had bridged the gap between civilization and wilderness. Carol herself swore she saw the Guardian one evening, standing at the edge of the forest where Jim used to park his truck, looking toward his empty spot with what seemed like sorrow. The national media arrived, eager for a dramatic story about a deadly bear attack. But the people of Shadow Creek were protective of both Jim's memory and the Guardian's reputation. They shared only what they thought Jim would have wanted known, that he died doing what he loved, that the encounter was a tragedy, not an act of aggression, that sometimes the line between the wild and the human world was thinner than anyone realized. What no one could have predicted was what would happen next, something that would make them question everything they thought they knew about the capacity of wild creatures to feel, to remember, and perhaps even to mourn. Dawn was breaking over Shadow Creek when Mary Whitaker first saw it. She had gone up to leave flowers at Jim's grave, a weekly ritual she had started since his burial. Through the morning mist, she noticed a large shape near the gravesite. Her heart stopped when she recognized the Guardian's distinctive form. Unlike every other bear encounter in her life, Mary felt no fear. There was something about the bear's posture that kept her rooted to the spot, watching in amazement. The guardian moved with unexpected gentleness for a creature of her size. She approached Jim's grave slowly, her cubs waiting at a respectful distance under a stand of aspens. When she reached the mounded earth, she lowered her massive head and did something extraordinary. She placed her crooked paw, the one that had made the tracks Jim had followed so many times, softly on the ground where he lay. That might have been dismissed as curious animal behavior, but what happened next defied explanation. The guardian released a sound unlike anything Mary had ever heard from a wild animal. It started as a low rumble, then transformed into something that made tears spring to Mary's eyes. The sound carried notes of what could only be described as sorrow. It was not a growl or a cry of aggression. It was something else entirely, something that seemed to come from a place of deep emotion. Within days, others witnessed similar scenes. Thomas Reed, a wildlife photographer who had worked with Jim, captured the first images of the guardian's visits. The photographs showed the bear in poses that shocked even hardened scientists. In one, she sat beside the grave, much like a person would, her usually fierce features softened. In another, she gently touched the wooden cross with her nose, showing none of the usual bear behavior toward man-made objects. But it was Ranger Peterson's video that truly captured the world's attention. Early one morning, her patrol camera recorded the guardian's entire visit. The bear arrived as the sun rose, her cubs now familiar with the routine of waiting in the background. For almost an hour, she remained by the grave, occasionally making those haunting sounds that witnesses had described as crying. At one point, she gathered small wildflowers with her mouth and placed them on the grave, a behavior that left wildlife experts stunned. The most compelling moments came when the guardian would press her ear to the earth, as if listening for something deep below. Her eyes would close, and those soft, mournful sounds would emerge. The cubs, watching from their safe distance, would answer with gentle calls of their own, creating what seemed like a family's shared expression of grief. Local authorities considered closing off the area, fearing the bear's presence might attract dangerous crowds. But the guardian seemed to know when it was safe to visit. She appeared only in the quiet hours of dawn and dusk, when few people ventured up the trail. Those who did witness her visits spoke of them in hushed, reverent tones, as if they had seen something sacred. Weather seemed to make no difference to her vigil. Through spring rains and early summer heat, the guardian's tracks appeared regularly at Jim's grave. Sometimes she would bring small offerings, pine boughs or berries, leaving them carefully arranged on the mounded earth. Other times she would simply sit in silence, her massive form softened by what observers could only interpret as sadness. The cubs grew stronger as the weeks passed, but they never approached the grave themselves. They maintained their distance as if understanding this was their mother's private ritual. Their presence added another layer of meaning to the guardian's visits, a reminder of the protective instinct that had led to the tragic encounter with Jim. Shadow Creek changed in the weeks following the guardian's first appearance at Jim's grave. The initial fear and calls for hunting the bear faded into something deeper. People spoke in whispers about what they had witnessed, not out of fear, but from a sense of respect for something they were only beginning to understand. The town council met on a warm summer evening to discuss the unprecedented situation. Instead of debating how to remove the bear, they focused on protection. Mayor Thompson, who had once supported controlled hunting in the area, now spoke passionately about preserving the guardian's territory. "What we are seeing here is not just about one bear," he said. "It is about reconsidering everything we thought we knew about the creatures we share these mountains with." Scientists arrived from universities across the country, drawn by the reports and videos of the guardian's behavior. Dr. Sarah Chen, a leading expert in animal cognition, spent weeks observing the bear's visits to the grave. Her findings challenged existing theories about animal emotions. "What we are witnessing here goes beyond learned behavior or simple instinct," she reported. "The consistency and complexity of these actions suggest a depth of emotional capacity we never imagined possible in non-human species." The guardian's story spread beyond Shadow Creek, touching hearts around the world. Local schools developed new programs teaching children about wildlife preservation, using the guardian as an example of the hidden depths in nature's creatures. Where once they taught fear of wild animals, they now taught understanding and respect. Ranger Peterson established special protocols for the area around Jim's grave. Signs were posted asking visitors to maintain silence and distance. The community took turns watching over the site, not to protect people from the bear, but to protect the guardian's private moments of apparent grief. They came to see themselves not as owners of the land, but as its custodians, sharing it with creatures whose emotional lives they were only beginning to comprehend. Carol's Diner became a gathering place for sharing stories about the guardian's visits. The wall where Jim's hunting photos once hung now displayed images of the bear's gentle encounters at the grave. The most powerful showed her in the morning mist, head bowed, with wildflowers scattered around her paws. Below it, Carol placed Jim's last written words from his journal. In nature's heart, there are no boundaries between species, only the connections we have yet to understand. As summer turned to fall, the guardian's visits continued, though less frequently. Each appearance added to the growing legend. Children wrote stories about her for school assignments. Artists came to capture her image. But most importantly, the way people thought about wild animals began to shift. They started to see them not as creatures driven purely by instinct, but as beings capable of complex emotions and connections. The story of the Guardian and Jim became more than just a local legend. It became a testament to the mysterious bonds that can form between humans and the wild creatures they share the earth with. In the end, what happened in Shadow Creek was not just about a bear's apparent mourning. It was about humanity's awakening to the deeper consciousness that exists in the natural world around us. Years have passed since that first morning when the Guardian appeared at Jim's grave. Shadow Creek is different now. The town's welcome sign bears a new image, a bear with a distinctive crooked paw print, symbolizing the protected status of what they now call the Guardian's Mountains. The hunting seasons have been modified, with special areas marked as wildlife sanctuaries where no hunting is permitted. The Guardian still appears occasionally, though her cubs are grown and have families of their own. Her visits to Jim's grave are less frequent, but no less meaningful. Each spring, when the wildflowers bloom, she makes her way up the familiar trail. Those lucky enough to witness these moments say she has aged gracefully, her fur now streaked with silver, but her gentle nature unchanged. Local hunting guides have developed new practices, inspired by Jim's ethical approach and the Guardian's legacy. They teach visitors about tracking and wildlife photography rather than focusing solely on hunting. Young apprentices learn to read animal behaviors and understand their patterns, just as Jim once did. His old journals, carefully preserved in the town library, have become teaching tools for a new generation of wilderness stewards. The children of Shadow Creek grow up with a different relationship to the wild. They learn about the Guardian in school, not as a cautionary tale of wilderness dangers, but as a story of understanding between species. During field trips to the mountain trails, they learn to identify her crooked paw print and those of her descendants, treating each discovery with quiet respect. Scientists continue to study the bear family, documenting behaviors that challenge our understanding of animal consciousness. The Guardian's offspring show similar signs of heightened intelligence and peaceful interaction with humans, suggesting these traits can be passed down through generations. Their research has influenced wildlife management practices across the country. On quiet mornings, it's still possible to see the Guardian making her way through the mist toward Jim's grave. She moves more slowly now, but with the same purpose that first drew the world's attention. The wildflowers on the grave are always fresh, tended by both human hands and gentle paws. It stands as a testament to a truth Jim always knew, that the line between the wild and human worlds is thinner than we imagine. Shadow Creek's story has become more than a legend. It's a reminder that sometimes the greatest understanding comes from the most unexpected moments. The Guardian taught them that the wild creatures sharing their world are capable of depths of emotion humans are only beginning to comprehend. And in that understanding, they found a new way to live in harmony with the wilderness that surrounds them. If this story of the Guardian and Jim touched your heart, there are more incredible tales of extraordinary animal behavior waiting to be discovered. Join our growing community of nature enthusiasts by subscribing to our YouTube channel, where we bring you daily stories that challenge our understanding of the wild world around us. Just like the Guardian showed us that animals are capable of deep emotions, each story we share reveals another fascinating aspect of wildlife that will leave you amazed. Click the subscribe button below to ensure you never miss these remarkable tales from the natural world.